Hello and welcome to the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Master Gardener Growing Season webcast series. My name is Susan DeBleek and I'm the Assistant Coordinator for the Iowa Master Gardener program. I just wanted to take a moment today to introduce the webcast and our speaker. Today's webcast, Urban Tree Selection, is part of a three-part webcast series. We're hoping that you'll watch all of them with your fellow Master Gardeners and other gardeners from your community. These webcasts are intended to help bring your Master Gardener volunteer projects to the next level. Today we've got Gabbi Edwards from Iowa State University Extension and Outreach talking about urban tree selection to give Master Gardeners and other gardeners ideas about how to make recommendations about tree species for urban landscapes and talk about site selection and tree maintenance. We've got two materials for you today. One is a worksheet to follow along with the presentation, and on that worksheet you'll also see a link to the online evaluation, so please jump online and give us a quick evaluation of this webcast. And a reminder to log your Master Gardener continuing education hours. You're gaining 2 continuing education hours today. The requirement for Master Gardeners is that each year you get 10 hours of continuing education, so please go online to the volunteer reporting system to log your hours. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Gabbi Edwards to give our presentation today about urban tree selection. Thanks, Gabbi.
Hello and welcome to the Master Gardener Summer Webinar Series. This one will be focused on urban tree selection and maintenance. My name is Gabbi Edwards. I am the Extension Urban Forester, and today we're going to talk a little bit about these topics. So we'll run through site conditions in an urban setting and how that could impact your species selection as well as the survivability of your species that you do decide to pick. Some desired benefits that might come along with certain species. How to choose a plant. We'll do a little bit of a discussion activity of different scenarios on how to choose a plant for different sites. How to plant and continued maintenance and training of trees, which is incredibly important. Maybe one of the most important parts of urban tree selection is actually caring for that tree. And then at the end, I'll run through some unique species that I find of interest that you might as well too. So to begin with, I'd like you to turn to your neighbor or turn to a partner at your table and just discuss maybe for about a minute what you think the number one pest is in an urban forest. So I gave examples of pictures: emerald ash borer, bur oak blight, storms, herbicide damage. So just take about a minute and turn to your neighbor and discuss what you think the number one pest is in the urban forest. All right, let's see if anybody got this answer correct. The number one pest in an urban forest is actually humans. We plant trees and we plant shrubs and other, garden type species with the best intentions. However, in the end, it's normally something that we do that ends up damaging or killing the species. There are so many things that people can do to their tree species that will harm them. If you prune them wrong, that will decrease their lifespan. If you plant them incorrectly, that will also decrease their lifespan. So everything that we do and every time that we touch that tree has an opportunity to cause damage and harm to that. So humans are the number one pests of trees in an urban forest. Next, I want you all to try to guess what the average lifespan of certain trees are. So the first one is a bur oak. How long do you think a bur oak should survive? And these are natural settings. So in a natural oak hickory forest that a bur oak would be in, or oak savanna, how long do you think the bur oak should survive to? And the answer is 250 plus years is the average lifespan of a bur oak. Next is red maple. Red maples should live to about 125 years or more. Next is a river birch. River birch can live to be about 65, 70 years old. That's a pretty healthy river birch. This next one is just for fun. How long has Chuck Grassley been our Iowa senator? He's been our senator for 36 years. And finally, we get to urban trees. What do you think the average lifespan of an urban tree is in Iowa? Less than 25 years. So this shows the impact that humans have on tree species. You plant a red maple in your yard, and theoretically, it should get to be, and granted you're in an urban setting, so it will be small, it will be a shorter lifespan. However, that tree should be able to live to be well over 100 years old. However, because of the conditions of the urban setting and the limitations that we have with nutrients and soil, most urban trees live to be less than 25 years. That's less than Chuck Grassley has been our Iowa senator. It's a very short amount of time that these trees are living when really they should be living much, much longer. So why is that? Why are trees in the urban setting living such shorter lifespans? And one of the key problems with urban trees is the urban underground. If you think of the types of soils and the condition of the soil underground in the area where your house was recently built or in a street tree lane, the condition of the soil is actually very poor. Most times you have extremely clay soils, you have extremely compacted soils, and that really plays an impact on the trees themselves. So this is a good example. This was in a home yard. So this normally you want to see, the rich, dark horizon of the organic matter, and then slowly transitioning down into that lighter colored clay sort of material. However, this is just mixed all in. You can see rocks all the way through it. It's just not a very healthy, resilient soil. This is an example of one underneath a sidewalk. So that is almost entirely clay. And urban trees are not going to get the nutrients that they need from soils such as this and in such harsh conditions. And then not only do you have to deal with the problems of urban soils and just their poor quality and lack of nutrients, but you also have to deal with things such as compaction. A lot of these homes, especially in newer housing developments and even older housing developments, have big equipment running over it. So you have that constant compaction on the soil also, which plays a key role in how well the roots can spread out and find nutrients and water. And so that's just another poor problem for our urban underground. Another condition that affects urban trees is water flow. So you see here a few examples of water in people's yards. So you might have standing water in your yard, an area where it's kind of low, you have that high concentration of clay, and it's just really kind of swampy and wet all the time. And you can see in the top right corner, actually a tree that was planted, and now the pit where the tree is completely full of water. Again, in the bottom right, you have an area where it is very wet, and I'm guessing these people probably irrigated in some way, and that's how you got this great distinction. However, it's a great example of the types of water availability that is available to these trees. They have areas and little pockets where it is wet enough that they get the full amount of water that they need, and then maybe if you plant a tree a few feet away, even, or a shrub a few feet away, you might have a completely different scenario that those trees have, a completely different water availability, nutrient availability. And that's just something to be aware of. An easy way to test for whether or not you have wet or dry soils in your site is to actually go out. I would go out a day before and dig your pit. So just dig, and it doesn't have to be anywhere near the size of what you would normally plant a tree, which we'll talk about in a little bit. but just dig down about a foot, make about a foot by a foot hole in the ground, and bring your hose over and fill it with water. You fill that pit with water, and you watch to see how quickly the water disappears from the pit, how quickly that water is soaked up by the soil around it. That will tell you whether or not you have pretty well moist soil, well-drained soil, versus a heavy clay that will hold and retain that water there. I've seen people do this test and the water is gone in as quickly as 10-15 minutes. And I've seen other people do this test on a different site and it takes a whole day for the water to be gone. And so you can see the variation of urban underground and how that affects water flow, and how if you planted a tree that was really did really not like wet feet, such as most evergreens and conifers, they really don't like to have wet roots, wet feet. And so if you plant a conifer in an area where it takes a day for that water to drain out, you're really looking at setting that tree back considerably in its growth rate as well as health. So next is available sunlight. Directions matter in this. And so you need to visualize, and sometimes this is hard depending on when you're planting your tree or how long you've lived in your home to see, or in this, how much you know about the area that you're planting in. But think about the sun when it's in the south during the winter, as well as when it's in the north during the summer, and what sort of available sunlight that site might have. It might be completely full sun in the wintertime, but when summer comes around, it's full shade. And that can play a big impact also. And, generally speaking, in Iowa, we want to maximize south and east exposure and minimize north and west wind exposure, especially if you're in kind of that rural-urban interface. And that will make a big difference also to know how much sunlight is available and what sort of species you want to plant. And even that impacts the height of your trees. If you want to have shade, then you might want to plant a taller tree in an area where, in that previous example where you have high sunlight in the wintertime, maybe that means you want to plant a tall tree to kind of catch that high sunlight only on the south-facing slope or whatever. Really, it comes down to what you're looking for in your own site, but being aware of how much sunlight is available throughout the year can make a big impact on the health of your tree once again. And then finally, some overhead and other considerations to be aware of. So a lot of people don't think when they're planting a tree, I'm planting this tree, maybe I should look up to see what else is in the area. And they end up planting a 70-foot tall tree underneath 20-foot tall power lines. And that is always going to be a problem, and no matter what, those power lines are going to win because they have companies that come through and prune. So these overground or overhead height restrictions are something to be aware of. Power lines, you don't want to plant tall trees right next to your home, especially if they might hang over your house. And then you have the risk of limbs falling on your home and causing damage to your property. Another thing to be aware of is chemical exposure. So if you're planting a tree right next to the road, we live in Iowa, we get ice. They use de-icing salts on the streets to clean the streets. Those de-icing salts can be extremely harmful to your tree. So you want to be aware of that and plant more of a hardy species if you're planting really close to a street. A species that can handle those de-icing salts much more than a sensitive tree that will just have those de-icing salts and then decrease in health extremely quickly. Again, if field pesticides, if you're on that rural-urban interface, you have to deal with agricultural pesticides. My parents live right next to a farm field, and they have pear trees. And every time the farmer comes through in the springtime, sprays his herbicides, we have that drift. And no matter what, you always get some amount of drift from field pesticides and just agriculture practices in general. And the field chemicals come in and drift into their yard and affect their pear trees, so they never get fruits. That's just an example of another thing to be aware of with pesticides and herbicides and chemicals that are being applied to agricultural lands if you are close to that proximity. And then, so just a few more things to be aware of. If you have a garden nearby and you want to grow tomatoes, don't plant a walnut really close to your garden that wants to grow tomatoes. There are chemicals that are released that will affect the production of fruits and vegetables such as tomatoes. If you have children playing nearby, it is probably a good idea not to plant something that has long thorns like a honey locust, just for the safety and your peace of mind that they don't run around, trip and fall, and get cut or pricked by a thorn. And then property boundaries. This is another thing that people don't consider when they consider planting a tree, is you don't want to plant a 80-foot tall tree only 3 feet away from your property boundary. Because if any limbs were to fall or cause any damage, you're liable for that on your neighbor's property. And there's also rules that say that any limb that hangs over into another person's property, they're allowed to go through and cut any sort of limb or branch that is on their property, on the side of their property. And so just another thing to be aware of. I mean, hopefully your neighbor isn't that disagreeable with you, but you have situations where that does happen, and you see a tree that hits the property line and then is almost sheared straight up because the neighbor doesn't like that tree for whatever reason. So just another thing to be aware of is that property boundary line. So next we'll get into how to select a plant. So we know a little bit about the characteristics of the urban environment and how that can be really harsh. The soil, the water, site restrictions that are there and present that you need to be aware of. And next we'll talk about how to select a tree. So when it comes to species selection, I think one of the main things that you need to consider is the diversity of the species that you're planting. Diversity is key, especially in today's world, and today's world is a perfect example of why diversity is important with emerald ash borer coming through. You know, we had Dutch elm disease a couple decades ago that wiped out all the elms. It seems like everybody replaced their elms with ash trees. And now, today, we're dealing with emerald ash borer, which comes through and has a very high mortality rate on species and is basically wiping out all of our ash trees and therefore wiping out a vast majority of our city and urban trees. And with the knowledge of emerald ash borer and Dutch elm disease, we want to increase the diversity of our urban tree population. There are so many other species available to plant outside of, the typical ones that you might think of when you first think about planting a tree. I know there are so many people who plant trees, and the first thing they think of is, I'm going to plant a tree. What tree should I plant? Oh, how about one of those maples that turn bright orange in the fall? Those are really pretty. An autumn blaze maple. Let's plant one of those. And then all of a sudden you have a whole neighborhood full of maple trees. And nothing against maple trees. I have nothing against maple trees. However, they are quickly becoming a large proportion of our city trees. So, for instance, the emerald ash borer that we're dealing with now, think of all of the news coverage, and you hear of cities spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more, dealing with the removal of ash trees because of emerald ash borer. Well, ash trees, on average in Iowa, make up about 17 to 18% of our city trees, urban trees in cities. So think of that and have that 17% number in your mind. Well, maple trees in city sites across Iowa make up an average of about 33 to 34% of our city trees. So you're looking at almost, 1.5 times, almost 2 times as many maples as there are ash trees. So if you think about the impact that a disease or a pest or whatever it is that comes through and hits maple, because it will eventually happen, will have in relation to what we're dealing with now with emerald ash borer. And that's why diversity is important. If you plant a diverse tree species throughout your area, even if you have a pest that comes through like emerald ash borer, you might lose maybe 1 or 2 ash and you still have 20, 30 healthy trees in your neighborhood without having to be that big of an impact is what we're seeing now. So take some time and look around your neighborhood, look around your street or in the city, wherever you're planting these trees at, and just kind of take a quick mental inventory of what is out there. If you're seeing a ton of honey locust in your area or along your street, maybe don't plant honey locust, find another species. If you see a ton of maple trees, don't plant maple, find another species. There are dozens upon dozens of different species that you can plant, especially when it comes to urban areas where you're looking more at ornamental species instead of the truly native ones that you would see in Iowa timber. You have a lot more options on what you can plant to create this diverse tree population. Other things to be aware of are soil pH and moisture tolerance of trees. There are several species that really don't handle highly acidic or highly basic soils, and that would be a really big problem for them in their health, overall health in their lives. So be aware of that. You can do a soil sample test and send it into Iowa State Extension, and they'll give you back data which will tell you what your soil pH is if you're curious. Next is to look at the mature height of the tree. A lot of time people have this misconception or a skewed perception of what your tree is going to look like in the end. It's easy to go to Home Depot or Lowe's and pick out, a little arborvitae or a little spruce tree, and it might only be 2 feet tall, and you think it's so cute and you want to plant it right next to your house, and you plant it maybe 3 feet away from your house. However, you don't take the time to look at the tag that says what the height is, and that tree might grow to be 40 feet tall, 30 feet wide, and you just planted it 4 feet away from your house because you didn't consider the mature height and mature width of that tree. So really take some time to look at not just the cute little one that you get from the nursery, but what it will become 20, 30 years down the road. Next is longevity. There are benefits, pros and cons to both fast-growing and slow-growing trees. Your desired benefits that you might get, whether it's for shade, beauty, and then the growth habit of the species itself, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So what are some desired benefits that you want out of your urban tree? Some people might be going for reduced home energy consumption, and then you're looking at, where the sun hits you during various times of the day, during various seasons, how to get that shade or the sun, depending on where you want it. Use for a windbreak. If you're on that rural-urban interface and you have some really high winds, you want to plant some spruce trees or arborvitae or create a windbreak that will slow that wind down, slow that snow down, and really protect your home. So that might be one other reason that you're looking for this urban trees. Another one is a nosy or a snoopy neighbor. You always hear of those one neighbors that are maybe just a little bit too talkative that you kind of want to subtly keep out of your yard or out of your lives in a way. That might be a perfect opportunity to use something like a honey locust that has thorns to kind of deter that situation a little bit more. As well as promoting wildlife for insects, birds, deer if you're living in that area. We are really big into pollinators now, so fruit trees with fruit or with flowers on them that can help with pollinators. And then I kind of group urban trees into two different sort of pools, and one of those is a hardworking beauty and a lazy beauty. So a hardworking beauty is a species that will be pretty all year round. So something like a red osier dogwood, which is the four pictures in the middle. So, in the spring they have really pretty flowers. They get bright red berries kind of in the summer, and then in the wintertime their bark is that characteristic dark red. And so that species is providing a level of interest throughout the year. You have the flowers, the berries, and the bark that are kind of adding attractiveness and interest throughout the year into different seasons, which might benefit you and your garden in various ways. And then you have something like a lazy beauty, which I call the crab apples, or the autumn blaze maple, the sunset maples, where the majority of the year they're just like a regular tree. There's nothing really all that interesting or exciting about them. However, there's just this one, maybe it's a 2-week window in the fall or the spring where they have really beautiful blossoms or really beautiful fall foliage. And that's perfectly fine. If you want that, that's fine. If you want the hardworking beauty, that's fine. Just be aware of when this species is giving you the level of interest that you want. If you're planting something in your garden that you really, really want that bright fall foliage, it might not be a big deal that, for the rest of the year it's a pretty normal tree. Or if you're looking for that all year round interest, be aware of the sorts of characteristics of that species when you're selecting it. So now you kind of think about where your interests are, what desired benefits you have, what sort of species you can have based on your site selections, and then now you're kind of ready to plant it. However, placement is key, and this is one of the big things that a lot of people mess up, and I kind of talked about this briefly before, but planting a large tree right next to your home is not going to end well. Obviously, your home will win because you don't want the tree. You wouldn't choose the tree over your home, but that kind of defeats the whole purpose of the 20 years that you just spent growing that tree if you're going to cut it down once it reaches mature height because it's just too big or too close to your home. So be aware of placement. This is an example of an apartment that species looks like it was maybe planted 18 inches, 2 feet away from that apartment building. Not a very good idea. This poor guy, and obviously this pool was here after that willow, because that willow is pretty large. But planting a pool, in this case, right next to a willow is not a very good idea either. Being aware of this sort of stuff. Willows are messy trees. They're beautiful, but they're messy. So don't plant something like a pool right next to them. Again, planting way too close to your house. This tree was obviously limbed up in order to keep it there instead of removing and replacing. But that just looks kind of funny. When you think driving down a road, it would look kind of funny to see a conifer like that be as tall as it is with no branches for the first 30 feet. Just kind of has an odd appearance to it. So be aware of this when you're planting. What is around the area that you're planting? Are you planting it too close to your home? Do you have a shed? What about a fence? People don't think about fences, planting close to fences very often. And so just be aware of the site surroundings that you're planting these trees next to. And placement is key. Next, we'll get into a growth habit of species, which I talked briefly about. But each species has a growth habit, and mostly they're kind of shapes that describe what the end result of a mature tree will look like. And so these are examples of the different types that you will see. Sometimes these growth habits will be listed on the nursery labels that you have when you're purchasing the trees. Sometimes it'll say like a pyramidal growth or something like that. Sometimes they won't. If you're curious, you can always Google. Google is an amazing thing that will tell you just about any information that you want to know. So if you're not sure what the end result of your tree will be, because most times the tags will just say, mature height 30 feet tall by 15 feet wide. Okay, well, does that mean that it is all over the place? Does it kind of have a shape to it? So it's good to know what this growth habit is so that you can have a better picture in your mind of what the tree will look like at maturity. So these are 3 examples. An American elm is vase shaped. You can see kind of how that looks like a flower vase, that shape. A Kentucky coffee tree is an example of an oval growth habit where you have this oval shape in the canopy. The pyramidal, which is a little leaf linden, makes that wide pyramid look. A few more examples would be round, which is a horse chestnut where the canopy is almost perfectly round, it seems. And then columnar. You can get some species. This example is of a tulip tree. However, most tulip trees, like the average tulip tree that you buy, will not be columnar shaped. This is a special cultivar that has this particular shape. And you'll see a lot of ornamental type species or hybrid species with cultivars having these special columnar shapes. These are really great for planting in narrow spaces or when you really want that burst of color, but you don't have a whole lot of room. That is what a columnar shape will look like, sort of like a pyramidal, but a lot narrower. And then you'll have something that they just call spreading, which is similar to a red oak. I like spreading because it makes it sound so fancy, but spreading is really just another term for it just goes all over the place. There's really no shape or characteristic of this. It just kind of goes wherever it wants to go, makes whatever shape it wants to make, and it just kind of is what it is. It's not really a specific shape that you can kind of map out. So those are just a few examples of the growth habits. Next, we're going to go into a little activity that I would like you all to participate in. I will give you several different scenarios. So as master gardeners, you might not just be planting trees in your yard. You might be called upon to plant trees throughout the city, throughout, on street boulevards, in different areas, and those can really have a big impact, and you're looking at a lot of different characteristics based on different sites. And so this is a quick little rundown of a few different examples that I have. So what I'd like you to do, we'll go into our first one and kind of do this as a practice round. So this is a park setting. This is an example of a park near my home. You can kind of see what the environment would look like that you're planting a tree in. So I'm requesting you to go out and tell me what tree to plant. take a few minutes, probably about three minutes. Turn to your neighbor, make groups with with the people in your room next with you, and discuss some things to avoid. What are some species that you would avoid based on this particular site? And then what are some things based on this site that you might be able to experiment with, that you can try out and move around and have that ability to plant? So take about 3 minutes in your groups, and once again, talk about things that you would avoid, characteristics of species that you would avoid, and characteristics of species that you would maybe go for in this particular setting of a park. All right, so I hope you had a good discussion at your tables. So I'll run through some of the things that I think of when I think of this park setting. So some things that I would avoid in a park setting, and there are truly no real right or wrong answers. These are just kind of what I think of when I would think of this site in particular. So if you had other things, that's great. These are just my opinions and my thoughts. So what I would avoid in a park setting would be trees with thorns, because once again, you have small children running around. You don't want to have that risk of injury there. And then also along those same lines, trees prone to weak branch unions. And so, for example, a silver maple has extremely weak branch unions, and they drop their limbs all the time. You don't want to plant a tree that has the risk of dropping its limbs. For those same reasons, you have children playing, you might have people picnicking underneath the trees themselves. It's just a risk that you don't necessarily want to have if you can avoid those thorns and the weak branch unions. And then I would also avoid needy plants, such as like apples. Apples take a lot of work to get to be a well-rounded tree, especially if you're looking for like fruit production. But if you're just going for health, they still require a considerable amount of maintenance. So I would recommend avoiding those needy plants. Most times in park settings like this, you're having city maintenance workers come through and maintain, and they're not going to give the proper maintenance that is needed to really have certain species thrive. And so think about kind of the low maintenance grounds, low maintenance trees. Don't plant something that will need a lot of work continually every year. Something that you can kind of run with, plant, and leave it alone, and it'll still be fine. And so some species that I'd recommend experimenting with based on this park setting site is something like a tulip tree. Tulip trees are beautiful. However, they get to be quite large at maturity, possibly up to 80, 90 feet, maybe more, very wide. The base gets really wide. So you need something with very open space to plant a tulip tree. But this would be a perfect opportunity to try to plant a tulip tree. Other ones would be American linden, oaks, bald cypress. The list could go on, but really avoid those ones with thorns and avoid the weak branch unions and kind of the needy plants would be my recommendation. So next we'll move to our next scenario, which is a narrow space. So this is at a hospital. You're trying to plant something with interest that goes in between the sidewalk and the building itself. So what sorts of species or characteristics would you look to avoid in this particular site? And what species or characteristics of species would you try to experiment with or use in this particular site? Take once again about 3 minutes to talk with your neighbors. So I hope you had a great discussion once again. Based on this narrow space example with the hospital and the sidewalk in between, some of the things that I would avoid would obviously be those spreading trees. You don't want something that grows very large, like vase-shaped trees even. You want to promote a tree with a very, very straight and narrow growth habit. So avoid the spreading trees, the the large vase-shaped, oval, pretty much most growth habits are going to be really restricted on that site based on the available space that you have. Another thing to consider is messy trees or fruiting trees. I walk a path in my neighborhood that has a lot of mulberry trees, and I'm sure you're all aware of the lovely characteristics of mulberry trees, and they have those berries that fall to the ground, stain the concrete, get on your shoes, and you track them everywhere. And so that's another thing. If you have a sidewalk right next to it, maybe avoid some of those messy or fruiting trees that could cause stains or stink or just create an unsightly area for that space. So once again, trees to try to experiment with would be that columnar growth habit. You can get just about any tree species that you would like with a columnar growth habit with various different hybrids and cultivars. They make maples that will grow in that sort of general growth characteristic. They have tulip trees, pear trees, all sorts of different species that will grow in that columnar growth habit. So definitely try to select something that has that growth, smaller size, smaller stature, just straight up more narrow growth that it will have at maturity. The next scenario is a parking lot. You might be called upon to help a local business plant trees in their parking lot. So this is an example of like a boulevard green space. It separates two sections of a parking space, and they want to know what species to plant. So take about 3 minutes once again, discuss with your neighbors what would you avoid in this setting and what would you kind of try to promote in this setting. All right, so my opinions of a parking lot scenario, things that I would avoid. I would avoid pyramidal growth habits. So when you have that really kind of point at the top, you're going to run into problems with cars parking underneath it. So that goes not only for hardwoods with that growth habit, but also evergreens with that growth habit. Most evergreens have this pyramidal growth. You don't want to have a really wide base because you have limited space with cars parking right next to it. Another characteristic that I would avoid would be drought-intolerant species. So the space available in that parking lot boulevard was pretty narrow. That was only maybe about 4 feet wide. And so you're limiting growth of roots that can grow out and find those nutrients in water. So don't plant something that won't handle drought very well, because most likely you're going to have issues with that area being dry. And you don't want to plant something and once again have it be too dry, and then you limit the lifespan and you're replacing it way too soon. So I would avoid that drought intolerant species also. And then something that I like to call finicky species. So a parking lot is an extremely harsh condition, an extremely harsh site to plant trees in. You have the hot asphalt in the summertime. That asphalt just radiates heat. So anything nearby an asphalt or a concrete parking lot is going to be constantly battered by extreme heat through the summer, especially here in Iowa. And then the flip side of that is in the wintertime, that business needs their parking lot cleared. So they're going to move the snow. Well, if they're moving the snow away from parking spaces for cars, you're going to have to put that snow somewhere. And a lot of times the snow plows put the snow in the green spaces where the trees are. So you'll have to face the idea that snow will be piled up against these trees. And with that snow comes, once again, that de-icing salt and other chemicals that are used to clear ice and snow from the parking lot. So don't plant finicky species that are really drought intolerant, can't handle high heats, can't handle snow plows or salts. Really, you just want a really hardy tree. And then another species that I would avoid, or characteristic that I would avoid, would be large-sized trees. There's really no reason for you to plant a giant oak in that 4-foot wide boulevard there, because think of the amount of roots that are needed in that area. You plant a large tree, they have a large root system. If you're restricting the size of that root system already, you're really just damaging the tree in the long run. So I would avoid large-sized trees too. So good trees to plant in that area would maybe be crab apples. You can plant some smaller maples. that won't grow as large. Honey locust and ginkgo are two species that can handle just about anything that you throw at them. So they would be perfect. They can handle the high heat during the summer from the asphalt. They can handle the snow. They can handle drought. Those two are just really great, hardy species that will basically deal with anything that you throw at them. Next example is this manicured garden. So you have a person that calls you up, say, I don't know what to plant in my yard. They send you a picture and their yard looks like this. So how would you, what species or characteristics, once again, would you recommend to be planted in something as manicured and structured? Once again, take about 3 minutes, discuss with your group, and then we'll come back and I'll share my opinions with you. All right, with that manicured garden, some things that I would be aware of and think about if I was recommending species for that is be aware of shape. If you remember the picture, and I'll flip back to it, this has very, very structured shaped arborvitae that are there, creating this certain visual characteristic. So the visual characteristic is the straight vertical lines. It might be something different in somebody else's yard. Maybe they are more low growing, kind of spreading, circular, square shaped. Their manicured gardens can come in basically any shape or size. And so just be aware of the shape that is going on and kind of the overall appearance that you either want to select a species that matches that same shape, or else if they're looking for an accent type of look, something that's different from the rest, go for something that would complement that same shape. So if you have a vertical one, most of them are vertical, and the client wants you to have something that adds interest and excitement to their yard, go for something that would complement that vertical shape. So maybe it would be a horizontal shaped species for whatever reason. So think of that as an idea. So then another aspect that you can have is to add color if you would like. Either stay the same or change it depending on what the person themselves is looking for. And then think about available light. So if you have a manicured garden that is already really dense, really, really shaded, you can't necessarily plant some species that you would like because you have to deal with that shade. And so think about available light when it comes to adding to an existing garden. You might not be able to plant the exact species that you like based on the light availability that's there. Or, you might have to remove another species or another tree to open up light to plant the same species. So there are just different scenarios that you can run through with this. Once again, I would avoid messy trees such as willow, unless, once again, that is the desired appearance. So manicured gardens are really based on what the person is looking for. If they're looking for you to completely match what's already happening in their garden, or if they want you to adapt and change and add interest. Just be aware of what is there in the garden already, what is existing, and what the person, the owner, really wants to get out of any additions. The next example that we have to work through is a city-street intersection. So what characteristics of trees would you avoid, and what would you promote in this area? Based on my opinions of this city-street intersection, some things that I would avoid, and I hope you came to the same sorts of conclusions, is avoid tall species. I kind of talked about this a little bit before, but avoid species that grow to be 50, 60 feet tall because you have that overhead height restriction of the power lines. Another one would be the spreading growth habits and conifers, depending on the closeness, the proximity that you're planting to the corner. You don't want to plant a conifer that is, has that really wide base only a few feet away from the intersection, because you'll block visibility for traffic. That could pose a risk for safety. You might have accidents there. You want to be able to see where you're turning and what cars are coming up to you at a traffic intersection. So that's just another way to avoid those conifers and that kind of spreading growth habit type species. And then once again, the fruit trees, you don't want to be putting a lot of mess, leaves, fruit. Some cities have restrictions on whether or not you can plant these messy or fruity trees along their streets for that exact reason, that they don't want to have to come back and clean it up if there are complaints. So something else to be aware of. Based on this intersection or this example, I would go for a low-growing species that has a small stature, small height, and then you really want to promote that open space at the bottom for that traffic visibility. The next example that we have to work through is a rural farmhouse. So I'm going for one specific thing here to be aware of. Try to figure it out with your groups, and we will come back and discuss in a little bit. So the one thing that I was hoping that you realized with a rural farmhouse example, wanting to grow trees in their yard, is a lot of rural farmhouses, especially in Iowa, use septic systems. You do not want to plant trees, whether they are shrubs or trees. Really, they should completely be avoided near the septic tank and field area. So just completely be aware of where that septic system is and avoid that. Unless you are really need to plant there for some reason, I would completely avoid it. Certain species to avoid, especially if you do have to plant, would be fruit trees. The roots could get into the septic system. It could pose a health risk. It's the chance of that happening is very slim. However, just something to be aware of. If you do plant fruit trees, I wouldn't use the fruit that is produced by those trees. Trees to avoid would be trees with deep roots. Those would be willows, maples, walnuts, poplars, and pines. There are a few other ones. Really avoid those because those roots are definitely going to get into a septic system if they are nearby. So that being said, try to go for trees with less aggressive roots, kind of more shallow roots. Ornamentals such as crabapple, dogwood, cherry, those are good selections for an area like that. And then really, when it comes down to it, plant your trees or shrubs away from the septic system. There is an old, kind of a wives' tale, I guess you could say, that you should plant at least the mature height of the tree away from the septic system. I think that is a good rule of thumb to follow. Ultimately, you just want to plant as far away as you possibly can from a septic system. Then our final scenario example is this one. These are street tree boxes. So you can see it has this little, this one's probably like 5 foot by 5 foot grate in a box where these trees are planted. So based on what you know and what we've talked about already, what are some characteristics that you would avoid or promote in a situation such as this? Okay, I fondly like to call street tree boxes tree coffins. These are extremely harsh conditions to plant a tree in, and most trees will not survive well in these tree boxes because of some of the things that I listed there. Root space, poor soil condition, you're going to have snow removal methods in the area, lack of nutrients and water, just because that soil is such a harsh condition. No matter what you plant, it's probably not going to do very well in a situation such as a tree box or a tree coffin. A few very hardy species that you can plant in a situation such as this would be, once again, the ginkgo, the honey locust. There are a few hardy maples that you can try to plant that would do okay. Once again, you're not going to have very great success with these just because of the limitations on everything, root, soil, water. So try to plant the hardiest species that you can, but know that ultimately you're probably going to end up replacing them within a few years. You might get 10, a little more, before needing to be replaced, just because of the harshness of this situation. So next I'm going to give you a quick run through of some of the planting and continued maintenance that you might need to deal with, and you might not know the proper way to deal with them to promote a healthy long-lived tree. So the first one is proper planting. Planting is one of the most important, if not the most important things that you can do to promote a healthy tree. And the first thing you need to look for is the root flare. So the upper right graph shows a difference between the graft location on a tree as well as the root flare. So when you plant these species, especially if they're containerized, you might have to deal with something that is buried several inches down before you actually hit the root flare. You want to plant the root flare about you're looking 1 to 2 inches below the level of the soil. And so that is something to be critical to find. If you plant it too deep or too shallow, you might get these circling roots that will eventually girdle the tree. So really take some time and find that root flare, which is right where the first few lateral roots come out, and that is where you will plant your tree at the proper height. So once you know the proper height of your tree, how wide do you make the hole? That is a pretty contested piece of information. I hear anywhere between 1.5 to 3 times the size of your root ball, and that is entirely dependent on your soil conditions. If you have really great soil, it's really deep, dark, rich, has a lot of nutrients and minerals in it, then you could go more towards the 1.5 times the size of your root ball. If you're like most people and it's solid clay, just crappy, harsh soil, go for the 3 times the root size. And then when you dig that hole, as you can see in the bottom right picture, you want to dig the hole with angled sides. Try to shoot for something around 45-degree angle on the sides. That will promote the best root growth and root spread out from that root ball or from a containerized root system. To have that sloped hole into where the roots will be creates a gentler sort of system for the roots to grow out of, as opposed to the straight wall where it's really hard for roots to penetrate into that area. So that's planting, and this is an example of a tree that we were going to plant that is containerized, and the top arrow on the left shows where the original soil level was on that tree. So if you would have just planted it straight out from the container, not taking the time to look for that root flare or anything, you would have been planting it about 4 inches to where we hit the correct planting depth, which is the arrow on the right. So you would have been planting it too deep, and that would have caused that circling root system and shortened the life of that tree. So just a visual example of what I'm talking about. Next is the difference between balled and burlapped trees. So there are 2 different types of species that you get when you plant. They're either balled and burlapped or container grown are the 2 most common types. Balled and burlapped have burlapped twine and cages wrapped around a larger root ball, and containerized are grown within a container. They have their pros and their cons. The biggest thing that you're going to deal with for each one is circling roots, especially with container grown trees. Container grown trees are grown in a hard plastic container, so as those roots grow out, they hit that hard plastic barrier and they can't grow out anymore, so they grow around. And that's where you get the circling roots that will eventually strangle your tree. So the best way to reduce that from happening is to take, I like taking like a pruning saw and having that kind of saw action and just shear off the outside inch of the all the way around of the circle of the container root ball. That will cut the root system and allow those roots to start spreading new again and have that remove that circling trend and allow them to start growing out. It was pretty common in the past to just slice maybe only 4 slices down, make an X type shape and cut those roots. However, that doesn't really stop the roots between the lines from growing in a circular motion. So it's really best to shear all the way around. That removes all of that circling root system that you'll have and really reduces the opportunity for the roots to grow in that circular shape. With balled and burlapped, you'll have to do the same thing. You don't necessarily need to shear like the container grown trees, but just be aware of any roots that you might see that are growing in that circle and try to cut those so that they will not continue to grow in that pattern. Balled and burlap, the biggest thing is to remove all of the material that you can. So remove the burlap, remove the twine, and remove the cages. There is some debate on whether or not keeping the cages in the ground makes a big difference with trees and their survival. I like to think of it as, if I can, I would remove it, because then you're just removing a potential risk down the line. Whether it does cause damage or not, if you remove it, it doesn't matter if it causes damage because you don't have that potential for that damage to be there. So I would really suggest removing everything, the burlap, the twine for sure, and the cage if you can when planting a balled and burlap tree. Next quickly is staking. Staking really does help to stabilize a tree. However, staking can be done very wrong. There are 3 different types mainly that you can stake. You can either do 1, 2, or 3 stakes. You really don't need to go any higher than 3 stakes. When you're staking, you want to stake about 3.5 feet off the ground, and that's it. A lot of people make the mistake of staking higher up into the tree or all the way up. If you stake all the way up or higher up into the canopy, you're kind of defeating the purpose of staking itself. So staking is meant to stabilize the lower portion of the stem. You want to stabilize that stem so it can get a good, strong root system built up and have the stability to move and deal with wind and other things that kind of hit the trunks of trees. If you stake or wrap, restrict the upper canopy with staking or whatever method, you're removing the ability for that tree to flex in the wind. And that flexing really helps the tree. When you're dealing with high wind situations, storms, whatever, the ability for that upper canopy to flex and move when needed is extremely important to the overall strength of the tree. So you don't want to restrict the movement of the upper canopy, but you want to restrict the movement of the lower stem. And so that's where we get that 3.5 feet off the ground is where your stakes should be. When you do stake, one of the biggest, most common errors that happen with staking is that you forget about it. You stake it, you think you're going to come back, and you never do. You get busy, and you come back a few years later, most times, and you end up with a situation like the picture shows where the stakes have now grown into the tree. Once that happens, the wound that's created from those stakes growing into the tree never goes away. It will always remain there as the tree matures. So if you see when a strong wind comes through and a tree seems to be snapped like 3 feet off the ground, right in the middle, for whatever reason, it just seems to be an odd place for the tree to snap. It could have ended up being a wound that was created when the tree was younger by stakes being left in the tree and creating that weak point in the stem. So staking is a good thing, but come back and remove the stakes or adjust the stakes as the tree grows. You really don't need to, you shouldn't have to have stakes more than 1-2 years tops after you plant a tree. So just come back and monitor it, and then after that 2-year mark, remove the stakes so that way you don't cause any further injury to the tree. Next is mulching. Mulching is a really, really common thing. It's really great for trees. However, it's really commonly messed up. You get these sort of hills created by really lazy people who make these hills, like the bottom left picture shows. I call them mulchcanos. There are lots of different quirky terms for them, but really that's not the way to mulch. You should be mulching about 3 to 4 inches deep, but you really want to make sure that mulch is away from the stem of the trunk. having mulch touch the stem of the trunk creates water retention. I mean, that's what mulch does. It kind of holds in moisture. Then you're having that moisture be right up against the stem of the tree, which can cause decay and other diseases and pests to get into the tree in that way. So 3 to 4 inches deep, keep it away from the tree itself, the stem itself. And ideally, you'd go out to the drip line. The drip line is where the furthest branches extend out from that tree. So the bottom right example shows an example of what a drip line would look like. That is the ideal situation. Obviously, if you have a large mature tree, you're going to get, then you'd be doing 30 feet of mulching, and that's not really realistic for people's yards. I totally get that. As much mulching as you feel comfortable with doing is good enough. Really, you just want to have that mulch to protect the trunk from any mower blight, we call it. If you don't have mulch, you have grass there, then you mow there and you injure the tree. Mulching just creates a protective barrier around the stem, and it adds organic matter back to the tree, retains moisture for that tree. It's really just a great thing to do, but just don't make those mulch volcanoes and damage the tree that way. Then finally is kind of watering. Watering is a big thing. I get a lot of questions about, I just planted a tree, how much should I water? And with the typical ISU extension response, the answer is it depends. It depends on a lot of things how much you water your tree. Depends on the weather, the current rainfall that you have, how much your soil retains water. If you have really waterlogged soil, you don't need to be watering a lot because you have that water stuck there next to the tree to begin with. Newly planted trees, if I had to give an answer, this is the answer I would give. Newly planted trees would need irrigation about 1 to 3 times per week. You might have that, probably keep that sort of regimen up for that summer into the fall of the first year, and then you can sort of taper that off after a few months of it being that irrigated. It depends, once again, on the tree and the health of the tree. However, avoid the top row picture examples. These are Gator Bags, is the company that's the same similar design and several different companies offer. But these are basically the lazy man's ways of watering. So you have a tree and you wrap a plastic bag around it, fill that plastic bag with water. That water slowly seeps into the ground and waters the tree over a longer period of time. However, that is basically soaking the stem of the tree in water, which will cause this decay, disease, pests. It's not very good to have the stem of a tree soaked in water like this. So what I would say is water this 1 to 3 times per week, and then water the whole root system. Most of the roots of the tree are not right below the stem of the tree. Most of the roots are out. They're spread out. They're to the drip line of the tree and beyond. That's really where you want to water instead of focusing your water stream just on the stem itself. Water the area around the tree, not the tree itself. And then this is only the beginning. So all the things that I've listed so far, mulching, planting, watering, they're all really good, really important for the tree, but it is just one segment of caring for a mature tree. This is a continual process. Trees live to be long, healthy lives. You need to continually monitor the tree for disease, pests, anything like that. Pruning is really important, to have a pruning schedule and create that and continue that every year just about. You might not be making pruning cuts every year, but you're at least evaluating your tree for potential to prune, whether that's dead or dying branches, broken branches, diseased areas. You want to have this as a continual process in order to create a long-lived, healthy tree. Next, I'll very quickly run through some urban species that I like. You should be able to get this, have your local county extension print this off for you, so I won't spend too much time on each species, but here are some ones that I find of interest that you could definitely plant in urban species that are outside of the typical ones that you see. So first is a bald cypress. Bald cypress get to be about 50, 70 feet tall. They are a deciduous conifer. So it is a conifer, it has needles. However, every year the needles turn this kind of bright auburn brown color and then they drop. And so that is an interest, an appearance thing for most people. So bald cypress is really good. And you can see I list out soil moisture, disease, and pests. So feel free to come back and take a look at these once again later on. Next is a ginkgo. Ginkgo are one of those really hardy trees that do well in just about any situation. You can get different cultivars of ginkgos that have varying fall foliage. So this is an example of, and I believe this one is called an autumn gold. That's the bottom picture that will turn this really vibrant gold color in the fall. They have unique foliage. They look kind of like fans. The one thing to be aware of when you're purchasing a ginkgo is to make sure that it is a male only. You only want to plant male ginkgos. I really honestly don't think that they even sell female ginkgos, especially in the nursery trade. However, it is always best to check. The females will produce a little ball that is the fruit, and the fruit reeks. It smells really, really, really bad. So you don't want to plant a female ginkgo, only plant the male ginkgos, but they're a great tree. Next is Kentucky coffee tree. The N in the top corner means that it is native to Iowa. So this is similar to a honey locust. If you can picture that, it has one leaf with lots of leaflets. And so the bottom picture is actually one leaf, very compounded leaves. It makes pods, seed pods, but for the most part, they're pretty easy to handle and clean up. This is just another great tree species. Northern catalpa. Northern catalpa are not native, but they are very pretty. They have extremely large leaves that are about heart-shaped. They're heart-shaped and they're about the size of a dinner plate. They're very large. And they get this really pretty flower that reminds me of an iris, a white iris. You can see at the top corner. Very pretty flower, very pretty foliage. They once again have seed pods, so be aware of that. However, this is a really unique tree and offers a lot of appearance aspects that are unique as well. Sweet gum. Sweet gum is once again a really unique tree. It has star-shaped leaves, and they turn bright red in the fall. They're pretty well adapted to most soil types that we have and moisture types that we have here in Iowa, and have pretty low pest problems. So this is another one that would really increase diversity in your local area for sure, is a sweet gum tree. White pine. White pine is native. White pine is another, it's not fully deciduous, but a lot of people find the problem of white pine lose their old needles. So every year when they grow new needles, they lose and drop their old needles. So the inside of the tree really has no needles. That confuses a lot of people. However, it's really pretty once again. It's a great wildlife tree, and it's pretty widely planted. It is native, so this is another great option. And finally, for the large trees, another one of my favorites is a European larch. This can grow quite large. It is a deciduous conifer, once again, so it has the needles, but it loses its needles every fall, similar to a hardwood. And it has a brilliant fall color. So these are the ones, if you ever go like out west, larch are the ones that you see all the pines, and then you have these little pockets of like bright yellow foliage. That is a larch. A European larch does the same thing. It has a very bright gold fall foliage color, and it is very unique in an urban setting, definitely. So next, just briefly, a few low-growing species that I enjoy. Flowering crabapple. Crabapple are pretty much beautiful. You can get them in thousands of different cultivars, it seems like. It seems like every year, every other year, they're coming out with brand new crabapple cultivars for different flower color, different foliage types. These are a few. Prairie Fire is at the very top. Snowdrift, and then Sargent is at the bottom, just for different flower color. You have the pink, the white, kind of pinkish white. They're great. For the most part, they don't have too bad of disease problems. They can get apple scab. However, a lot of the new varieties that they're coming out with are resistant to apple scab. So just be aware, try to search out those cultivars and hybrids that have that resistance there. Next is serviceberry. Serviceberry is a native small stature tree to Iowa. It has really pretty white flowers. The foliage turns this really vibrant, kind of orangish red. It almost reminds me of burning bush, that same sort of fire color. It does produce berries. The berries are this sort of purplish pink. A great wildlife tree, once again, fairly tolerant of pretty much everything, every site that you can put it on. Just a great, and this is a great native option if you're looking for native specific trees. Next is Japanese tree lilac. You see a lot of these around. Basically, to sum this up in one sentence, this is a lilac bush in tree form. You get the lilac, the flowers, the scent of lilacs. However, it's just a small tree. It's pretty well tolerant to salt spray, so that's really good if you're planting close to a road. And besides that, once again, no real disease problems and tolerant of pretty much any soil that you can put it in. Common choke cherry. This is once again an Iowa native. It is adaptable to pretty much everything. Has dark berries that you can see the picture of, which are actually edible to humans as well as wildlife. Love them for sure. And they get this really delicate white flower also. So this one grows about 20 to 30 feet tall. So it's once again a small stature tree. Dogwood. There are several different species and types of dogwood out there. They have like normally this white berry, white flowers. You might see some color variation in different hybrids. Once again, really well adapted to pretty much anything. If you get a red osier dogwood is a species, red osier dogwood. Those are the ones that have that bright red bark that you see in the wintertime, especially along like Iowa highways. They plant them a lot along the Iowa highways for that red interest in the summer, or in the wintertime, I mean. Hawthorn. Hawthorn is once again an Iowa native. It has uniquely shaped leaves, as you can see in the bottom. Spring flowers. You can get these in several different cultivars, once again, for different flower colors. And they do have berries that last throughout. Hawthorn trees can get cedar apple rust, which is a disease. Will not kill the tree by any means. It can be a little unsightly, but besides that, it doesn't really have any other problems. Just another great option, and it's native once again. And then the last species that I have to recommend to you is the eastern redbud, an Iowa native. I'm sure you are all very familiar with redbuds. They have the heart-shaped leaves, bright pink flowers in the fall, kind of aromatic. Just another really well-rounded species that we have here in Iowa that would work well for a site. So that is all I have for you all today. I appreciate you coming to listen, and I hope that you learned about the different characteristics of urban sites, what make them such harsh conditions for trees and shrubs, and what things to be aware of and have in your mind as you're considering planting a tree. So once again, that's that growth habit, whether or not it can tolerate drought resistance, have the soil conditions, soil pH, just better understanding of our urban sites and how to best select a tree for that area to promote a long and healthy life for that tree. This is my contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. I reply to emails pretty quickly. If you prefer and you have a specific question, you can email me, and if you email me, it's easier for me if you email me a photo of what you're talking about. That way I can get a better understanding and a well-rounded information of what is taking place in that site. So thank you very much, and have a great day.